Okay, well, good afternoon. We're a little bit early today, but that's because Kris has to leave about 4:45, and I wanted to have a full hour. So hopefully we're not going to cover anything in the first few slides we haven't already talked about a little bit. Purpose of today's session is it's the third in our series. We've talked about viruses and vaccines, and now Kris is going to take us into more of the detail of the vaccines that are being worked on for COVID-19. Kris Rebillot is the Director of Communications for the Buck Institute, which actually has an active program on COVID. She comes out of the journalistic world by way of a few years in which she played around with trying to help poor people in genetics try to communicate things, and then ended up in 2003 up at the Buck Institute founding their media program. And if you've signed on to any of their webinars, you'll find she's the hostess for those, and some of those are very impressive, I must say. It's always nice to see people like Redfield who actually have a chance to talk without having to ask the president's permission. And I enjoyed Gallo too. I have to say that Gallo is a prize. So with that as an introduction, Kris, you're on.
Great. Thank you, George, and welcome to everybody. Glad to be here. Before I get started, I just want to give a caveat. So I am a communicator. I am not a scientist. So I'm going to, the information today is sort of top and mid-level. So just if you have detailed scientific questions, I'm likely going to say, heck if I know, but maybe I can give you some resources where you can find the answers that you're looking for. And so today, just basically, I want us all to get a chance to understand what vaccines are and what the basics are. So, simplest thing, vaccines train the immune system to recognize a pathology that the body has not yet encountered. So, how does a vaccine get from the lab to the clinic? So, I got this from the New York Times. They have a really great vaccine tracker that they update regularly. This was updated as of Monday. So right now there are more than 135 vaccines that are in preclinical, and we'll talk about what that means. 19 in phase 1, 12 in phase 2, 8 in phase 3, and 2 that are approved. And those 2 that are approved, there's 1 in China that has been approved for the use in the military. And then the second that's been approved is that vaccine that Russia claims that they have developed. I think there is a ton of well-grounded skepticism about that vaccine, but that's the explanation for that. So, whoops, let me go back. So let's start from the back. So preclinical vaccines, that happens in the lab. It's when scientists give vaccines to animals, such as mice and monkeys, to see if their vaccine produces some sort of immune response. Phase 1 is when scientists give the vaccine to a very, very small number of people. They want to test basic safety and dosage, as well as to get a sense whether it really does impact the immune system. So phase 2 is an expanded trial. Scientists give the vaccine to hundreds of people split into groups, such as children and the elderly, and we'll talk about that later as far as when it comes to COVID-19, to see if the vaccine acts differently in different populations. The trials take another deeper look at safety and whether it's got any efficacy as far as the immune system goes. And then phase 3 is where things get really interesting. So this is where things really show promise. This is where scientists give the vaccine to thousands of people and wait to see how many folks get infected with COVID-19 compared with volunteers who receive a placebo. These trials can determine if the vaccine protects against that coronavirus. In June, the FDA said a coronavirus vaccine would have to protect at least 50% of vaccinated people to be considered effective. So that's 50, it works in 50%. That could be enough to say it's effective. And we'll cover it later, but I think there's a really good chance that we're gonna have more than one vaccine that's going to be approved.
Kris,
yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Gabriel, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Gabriel?
Verdin, I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to put my hand up.
Okay, so we'll get back to Kris.
That takes care of that. Okay, so the approval process, regulators in each country review the trial results and decide whether to approve the vaccine or not. During a pandemic, a vaccine may receive emergency use authorization before getting formal approval. Once a vaccine is licensed, researchers continue to monitor people who receive it to make sure it's safe and effective. And of course, in this country, it's going to be the FDA that is going to finally approve a vaccine, or hopefully will finally approve a vaccine. I want to say there's also combined phases, and so what they're doing with coronavirus and the vaccine hunt, and we'll talk later about Operation Warp Speed, is that they combine phases. So some coronaviruses are now in phase 1 and phase 2 trials, for example, in which they are tested for the first time on hundreds of people. So that's the process of how a vaccine gets from the lab bench to the clinic. I also want to say here at the Buck, we are not doing vaccine research. Our research is based on how the host, which means humans, how we respond to the virus, and whether there are drugs and interventions that can be given to people that stop the virus from replicating in us. So we're more interested in treatment options than we are in vaccines. Vaccines development is a whole other kettle of fish, and you know, we're not experts in it, so better that experts are doing the work on that. So, types of vaccines. So there are, and let me get my notes here because believe me, I'm learning a lot as you guys are. So there's whole virus vaccines. So those are vaccines that use a weakened or inactivated version of the coronavirus to provoke an immune response. In general, inactivated viruses that are whole viruses but they've been inactivated, do not provide as strong of an immune response as a live virus that's been tweaked a little bit. So in this case, for whole virus vaccines, additional doses may be needed to get a strong enough immune response. So just so you know, if they come out with a vaccine and you have to take 2 doses, good chance it came from a whole virus vaccine. And I want to let you know, let's see. So 4 vaccines using inactivated versions are in phase 3 trials. 3 of them are in China. Several vaccines using weakened version of the coronavirus are in preclinical research. This is the type of vaccine used in measles, mumps, and tuberculosis. There are also genetic vaccines. These are vaccines that use 1 or more of the coronavirus's own genes to provoke an immune response. There are viral vector vaccines, and that's vaccines that use a virus to deliver coronavirus genes into cells and provoke an immune response. So that's literally where they use a harmless vaccine as to deliver the genes that are going to turn on the immune response. And then there are protein-based vaccines, and these are vaccines that use a coronavirus protein or a protein fragment to provoke an immune response. And I think everybody has seen so many pictures of this coronavirus. It has these spikes on it. That's where it gets its name. The corona sort of looks like the sun and the halo that comes around the sun. And there are a lot of vaccines that are vaccines and potential treatments that are targeted to do something to that spike protein, because that spike protein is how the coronavirus attaches to our cells and gets us in all the trouble. And then there's also vaccines, older vaccines that are already in use for other diseases that may also protect against COVID-19. We're going to talk about those too. So whole virus vaccines, I already mentioned this. This is a type of vaccine used in measles, mumps, and tuberculosis. This is the vaccine that scientists have more experience with. So these are easier to move ahead because there's more experience with them. So these genetic vaccines, as I said, use one or more of the coronavirus's own genes to provoke an immune response. There's a company called Moderna that is in phase 3 trials that use a genetic vaccine. They hope to have a vaccine ready by early 2021. Pfizer is in phase 3 with a genetic vaccine, and they say they hope to have a few million emergency doses ready for emergency use. So that's a little deeper dive into the genetic vaccines. Then there are the viral vaccines, which I said they use a virus to deliver the coronavirus genes into cells. AstraZeneca via the University of Oxford, and the University of Oxford early on has just been a leader in research on the coronavirus and has just done great work on this whole vaccine hunt. So AstraZeneca is in phase 3 in England and Brazil. This past June, AstraZeneca said their total manufacturing capacity stands at 2 billion doses. Merck is in preclinical development of a vaccine using the same approach it used for their successful vaccine for Ebola. So exciting activity in that realm. And then protein-based vaccines, vaccines that use a coronavirus protein or a protein fragment to provoke an immune response. At this point, all protein-based vaccines are either in preclinical phase 1 or phase 2 trials. None of these have yet moved to phase 3. And then repurposed vaccines, so vaccines already in use for other diseases that may also protect against COVID-19. So George mentioned Bob Gallo, who was in one of our webinars, and I'm going to make a plug for our webinars. If you want to do a deep dive into the public health, epidemiology, the science of people who are who are developing treatments, you can go to our website. You can find those webinars. I had the pleasure of interviewing Bob Gallo, who was one of the co-discoverers of the virus that causes AIDS, HIV/AIDS. And he thinks that the polio vaccine could buy us some time. That, if people got the polio vaccine, it would elicit enough of an immediate immune response that it could keep the COVID-19 virus at bay until we really develop vaccines specifically for COVID-19. Dr. Gallo had hoped that there would be a clinical trial involving polio in this country. The CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services decided they wanted to spend the money elsewhere, but there is a clinical trial happening now in Europe where they're looking at repurposing the polio vaccine. And there's been some talk about repurposing the measles and mumps vaccine. There's some indications that people who have been recently vaccinated for those diseases, that they might have some sort of protection against COVID-19. So let's talk about herd immunity, because that is the thing that everybody wants to get to. And let me get to my notes on that. So herd immunity is what happens when we get an indirect protection from a contagious disease that happens when the population is immune either through vaccination or immunity developed through previous infection. So this is all about community. So what are the challenges in creating herd immunity? Well, the deal is the more infectious a disease, the greater the population immunity needed to ensure herd immunity. So measles is highly infectious. So 95% of the population needs to be immune in order for the wider group to have herd immunity. COVID-19 is not as infectious. There's an organization called Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. They've been saying that 60% of the population needs to be immune. There was new research out just early this week that said maybe only 50% of the population needs to be immune so that the rest, everybody else can be protected. And this is really important when it comes to older adults, because older adults tend not to respond to vaccines as well as younger people. And so we really need herd immunity. We need all the people around us to be immune from the disease in order to protect us. So there have been some talk and in some countries about herd immunity, and that, gee, we just ought to get herd immunity by letting COVID-19 run wild in the community, and that's the best way to get herd immunity. Well, they've tried that in Sweden. That was their initial response. Sweden made an effort to protect those who are most vulnerable, which includes older adults like all of us. It didn't work that well. Sweden has one of the highest death, I think has the highest death rate in all of Europe. And even though they kept their economy open, their economy has taken a huge hit. So as far as letting COVID-19 run wild and just going, okay, people are going to get it, we'll try to protect the most vulnerable, not a good idea. Science has proven let's not go that way. Also, we have to look at the other barriers to obviously herd immunity are people who describe themselves as anti-vaxxers. So anti-vaxxers are referred to as free riders in the whole issue of creating herd immunity. They don't want to get vaccinations, so they hopefully try to benefit. They get the benefit of other people who have been vaccinated. But the issue is that when you get a bunch of free riders, especially if they're in the same vicinity, the same community, then they can punch a big hole in that herd immunity. And that has happened, I think, in some communities with measles. So there's real dangers in anti-vaxxers. I just will say that. So there you go. Anything else I want to say that? I don't think so. Okay, all right, next slide. So I think everybody has heard about Operation Warp Speed. That's a public-private partnership that was initiated by the federal government earlier this year to facilitate and accelerate the development, manufacturing, and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. It was introduced by the Trump administration in early April 2020. So what are we talking when we're going? So Operation Warp Speed has a lot of money behind it. So far, $11 billion has been given to these companies, Moderna, which I've mentioned, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Merck, AstraZeneca, and other companies that are involved in manufacturing and distribution. So this is, I think, a wise gamble on the part of the government. They are supplying money for these companies to both develop and test vaccines at the same time. The odds are in biotech, a lot of things don't work. So this could be money down the drain with vaccines that don't work, that never see the light of day, but it's to compress the time. So the vaccines are going to go through the same approval process, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. But as I mentioned earlier, they're compressing the time. So they're doing phase 1, phase 2 at the same time, phase 2, phase 3. And while they're doing the trials, they're manufacturing the vaccines. So if something works, it will be able to get out into the public as soon as possible. So that's the idea behind this Warp Speed, Operation Warp Speed. Operation Warp Speed is also doing work in diagnostics and testing, because Lord knows we need help in that regard as well. So there have been concerns, and there are concerns that have been raised about, and usually I just want to back up and say that it often takes up to 10 years for a vaccine to be developed. And I think maybe I heard that the mumps vaccine was done in about 4 years, was a compressed time for the mumps vaccine. But they wanna do this quicker. The companies need money because vaccines are usually not a moneymaker for a biotech, a pharmaceutical company. And that's another reason why they take a long time to develop, because the companies want to hedge their bets, because they know that vaccines aren't big money makers for them. But everybody has come together. I just want to say from here at the Buck, our perspective, the scientists here are just enjoying doing science, because, excuse me, there's so much collaboration among institutes, among drug companies. You know, there have been a lot of borders and boundaries in the world with this crisis, but scientists have really stepped up to the plate, and they're ignoring boundaries and barriers, and they're saying, we're not going to worry about whether we're competing with this place or not. We're not going to worry who's going to be first. We just want to get the vaccines done. So really my hat's off to the scientist. That's been one of the most interesting things, sort of tracking this pandemic and how it's happening, is that on the science side, there's really great things happening. Personally, I think they're going to be the heroes of this whole situation. So, in answer to some issues about vaccine testing and about who's going to be tested and if it's going to be safe, I did interview Dr. Robert Redfield on July 14th. He is the director for the Center for Disease Control. I want to say the day after I interviewed him, the White House sort of cut the CDC off at the knees as far as some of their data is concerned coming out of hospitals. In these days and age, you never know how the politics is affecting the science, hopefully not. But so this is what Dr. Redfield said during this webinar, and I really do encourage you to listen to it because it's got a lot of really good stuff in it. So when I used to do vaccine trials, we didn't enroll people over the age of 45 because the immune system also ages. We never enrolled people that had diabetes or significant disease. As we all know, those comorbidities are a risk factor for COVID-19. So now these studies are being designed in a way to be inclusive of the population that we hope the vaccine will be available for. Same thing with pregnancy. You know, we rarely would enroll pregnant women into vaccine trials, but if we're planning to offer vaccines to pregnant women, they really do need to be enrolled in this phase 3 trial. So that's how Dr. Redfield says the trials are going to be run. So in addition, he says we're going to have multiple platforms of vaccines, and some of them are going to be intrinsically safer for the elderly. And some of them will have a propensity that I could compensate the senility issue by different adjuvants that I could use. So an adjuvant is something that is added to the vaccine that makes it stronger. So there are, I think, stronger versions of the flu vaccine that have a special adjuvant added to it that will hopefully boost the response in older adults. And sometimes, you know, we like maybe have a 20% response to a vaccine, which is better than nothing, but sure isn't great. So continuing off Dr. Redfield, people ask me, well, how are you going to prioritize the vaccine? I don't know what vaccine I'm prioritizing. I need to know, how does that vaccine perform in the different populations? So if we have a great vaccine that was available now, and we have 100 million doses, but we find out that the elderly don't develop an effective immune response to it, well, we're probably not going to prioritize that vaccine in the elderly. On the other hand, there may be vaccines that are uniquely preferential for individuals that are older. So like I said earlier, I think I hope that there's going to be more than one vaccine, and that there will be vaccines that are targeted to different populations. So for example, the Moderna trial, which is in phase 3, I looked at clinicaltrials.gov. This is the inclusion criteria for the Moderna vaccine. They are including participants who are at high risk of SARS-CoV-2 infection, defined as adults whose locations or circumstances put them at appreciable risk of exposure to the coronavirus, healthy adults or adults with pre-existing medical conditions who are in stable conditions. So that means folks who have type 2 diabetes, folks who have asthma or COPD, people who have heart disease, but everybody's got to be in stable medical condition. So, for the 3 months before they go in the trial, they have to be stable. But, it looks like, as far as the clinical trials, as far as older adults, I think we're included. I read something today where it said they're having the whole issue with vaccinating pregnant women, that people the companies aren't including them as well as they are the broader range of the population. So Dr. Anthony Fauci, when he testified before the Congress on July 31st, he said definitely a possibility the United States would have an effective vaccine against COVID-19 by early next year. Let's hope he's right. I want to say I saw a survey this morning from the Physicians Foundation, and nearly half of the physicians that belong to that organization do not see the virus being under control until after June of next year. So that's what the majority of physicians said, and 59% of those physicians see opening society, as far as opening businesses, opening schools, opening things up, that's actually a greater risk to public health than the prolonged isolation that all of us are dealing with and trying to get through as best we can. So that's my blurb on vaccines. I want to talk a little bit about what's happening at the Buck. There's a lot happening at the Buck. So we are involved in a collaboration with an organization called QBI. It's an offshoot of UCSF. That effort is led by Nevin Krogan. He's an adjunct faculty at the Buck. I interviewed Nevin for one of our webinars. He's a real character. He's a great guy. So what this project involves is they really drill down to discover the pathways that the coronavirus interacts with once it gets inside our body. And then they started screening existing drugs that are already approved by the FDA, drugs that are so-called experimental, that maybe made it through phase 1 or phase 2 trials. And they're seeing which of those drugs impact the coronavirus and have an impact on the immune system, for better or for worse. And so that's a way to look at drugs that are already in use that could help against the coronavirus. I want to say that one of the things that Nevin mentioned in his webinar, and I haven't heard anything to the contrary, he mentioned, like, it's a chemical name, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but there's a chemical that's in many cough syrups and many cough suppressants, like NyQuil and Dayquil and that kind of stuff. And they actually found that in lab dishes, that chemical actually supported viral replication. So I don't take NyQuil anyway, but if any of you take NyQuil, you might want to listen to Nevin's webinar and see, use some caution when you take over-the-counter drugs. I also want to say I also interviewed Kevin Tracy, who's with Northwell Health. He's the chief of research at the Feinstein Institute, which is connected to Northwell. Northwell is the biggest provider of healthcare in New York City. And they are currently in clinical trials looking at the common heartburn drug Pepcid, because there's a possibility that Pepcid may help blunt viral replication. I think it's really fascinating. I'm trying to follow that. There have been the clinic, there's been no results from that published yet, but people are looking at, I think, every option possible. I mean, there's been, studies out about steroids, that, common steroids that seem to work well against the coronavirus, at least for people who are, in the midst of massive inflammation with it. So that's our collaboration with UCSF. So the Verdin Lab, Eric is the Buck CEO. He's working with Nevin Nevin, he's heading a subgroup. Now, I want to say in Nevin's collaboration, there are over 100 scientists from around the world. The Pasteur Institute in Paris is very involved, and there are, I think it's Columbia on the East Coast is very involved. Eric's lab looks at the immune system and metabolism as it relates to aging. And so Eric is heading up a subgroup of researchers under Nevin's umbrella, looking at how pathways that involve metabolism are impacted by these drugs and are impacted by the coronavirus. I can tell you that some of the pathways that are impacted by the coronavirus are also pathways involved in aging. And so Eric's team is taking a deep dive into that. They're also looking, and in regards to that, there are enzymes called sirtuins that regulate key metabolic processes. Eric is, in the world of science, he's famous for his research in sirtuins. So he's looking at that. He says early research suggests that inhibiting sirtuins could be a novel therapeutic strategy. There's also a protein called ORF8, which has been implicated in the cellular response to viral infections. So his lab is looking at how ORF8 contributes to COVID-19, and then also macrophages, they're immune cells that eliminate, get rid of, clean up pathogenic microbes, and they're looking at those as far as how drugs interact and how COVID-19 is involved in that. So that's Eric's lab. We have the Newman lab here at the Buck. John Newman is a great guy. He's a scientific researcher on aging. He's also a practicing geriatrician. He cares for patients at the San Francisco VA hospital. There's a great webinar with John. John talks about his experience caring for older adults. He has some really good advice for older adults who want to stay safe and want to stay healthy in the midst of this pandemic. So John is very interested in something called delirium, especially as it relates to COVID-19. Delirium is not dementia. Delirium is what happens when people go to the hospital and they're in a totally different environment. Their sleep-wake cycles get screwed up. Nothing is familiar, and they can hallucinate. They can have all kinds of medical issues. People who come off ventilators usually have delirium. So John is really focused on how to prevent delirium, how to get people out of delirium if they're into it. His lab studies something called ketone bodies, which are related to a ketogenic diet. And he is looking at the role of ketone bodies in acute inflammatory complications, and that there's a possibility, he thinks, that giving folks supplements of ketone bodies might actually help them deal with some of that out of control inflammation that can happen with COVID-19. We have the Furman Lab and the Weiner Lab at the Buck. They have formed a collaboration. They are looking at that cytokine storm, which is an uncontrolled production of inflammatory mediators. You guys may already be aware of this, but you know, when we get an infection, the first a pathogen comes into our cells. The first thing the body does is it has an innate immune system that comes to the fore right away and tries to knock the virus down. And the innate immune system is supposed to give our adaptive immune system time. The adaptive immune system is the part of the immune system that mounts a specific response to COVID-19. And the adaptive immune system is where the antibodies are formed and where the, if the vaccine works, that's where it's the adaptive immune system is where the body's going to remember, COVID-19, we know how to fight this. There's an issue with aging, that as we age, our innate immune system gets weaker. There is an imbalance between the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. And I think you probably have heard stories of folks who get COVID-19, they're sick, and then they start to feel better. And then about 4 or 5 days after that, they get really sick. And that's because at that point, the innate immune system hasn't turned off and the adaptive immune system isn't doing well. And so the body just spits out all of these cytokines, which are inflammatory proteins that are response to infection. And people at this point don't die from COVID-19. They die from the inflammatory response that causes sepsis and causes the whole immune system to go haywire and causes massive organ failure. We don't want to go there, that's for sure. So just a pitch for you to support our research. We would really appreciate any help that you can give us. We have a Buck COVID-19 research fund that you can donate to. You can also go to our website, stay in touch, sign up for our newsletter on our website. We do really appreciate your support. And before I open it up to questions, I just want to say, and John Newman covered this really well in his talk, his webinar, is that older adults have very, very different responses to COVID-19. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here because I think I can figure out how to do that.
I can do that.
Oh, good. Take me on. There you go.
Participant sharing.
Perfect. Great. So,
okay. All right. I'm gonna
Yep.
open it up.
Okay.
And I should comment before I do that John Newman will in fact be speaking to our Sunday Symposium series over this winter, although that will probably be a Zoom series, not our everyday normal in front of everybody series. So I'm going to ask the first question, and then we'll open it up for people to raise hands or ask questions on their own. If I combine 2 or 3 things together, what I say is, okay, maybe we have a good outcome, but we're likely to have that. We're likely to have that focused on, let me just say the average person, not the elderly. Okay, we then have the problem with getting vaccine out to people and with the anti-vaxxers. Okay, so in terms of my having protection as a so-called elderly person, my having protection, isn't that going to take an awfully long time?
So here's my personal take. I'm definitely, want the vaccine. If people I trust say it's safe, I'll take it. But I personally am not going to consider myself safe until there are treatments out there. So that in case I come down with this thing, that there are going to be treatments that can help me get over it and not get sick. Right now, there are, there's I can never pronounce it, Resdemerol. Anyway, it's a treatment that's been approved. It helps people get out of the hospital quicker. There have been early research that says it should be given earlier in the disease. Right now, it's only available in IV form, and so it's you can't if you get tested positive for COVID-19 and you go to your doctor and you say, can I have this Resdemivir? It's not available. So personally, vaccines, treatments, I will probably be wearing a mask in public and not going out to restaurants for a longer time than most people. And another thing I just want everybody to be aware of, and John covered this in the webinar, and maybe he'll have to cover it when he talks to you later on, is that older adults can have very different symptoms of COVID-19. So older adults tend not to mount fevers. I know for me, my normal body temperature is like 95 or 96 point something. So, you know, if my temperature is 98 or 90.99, that's a fever for me. But, you know, when I go out someplace and they do the fever checks, it doesn't mean anything for older people. Older people often don't have a cough. Sometimes older people will be mostly impacted by just being so tired and wiped out that, you know, that may be their key symptoms. They may be confused. They may feel off. So just be aware of that. And I'm a Kaiser member. I sent an email to Kaiser recently because I had to call in for something, and their voicemail talks about if you have fever and shortness of breath. Well, it's like you got to change that because there's a whole lot more symptoms now of COVID-19. And some people say that the most reliable symptom is that if you lose your sense of smell and taste, that if that happens, that may be the best early signal that you may have come down with COVID-19. So I just want to put that out there to everybody, so everybody's aware of that.
Okay, Marilyn, you had a question.
I do. You had mentioned earlier that Pfizer's vaccine would be used for emergency purposes. It's too late to get the vaccine if you already have COVID. So what would be the emergency? Would it be like, I'm just thinking, would it be like if a community had a sudden raging, it's sweeping through, say, a nursing home? And then if that's the case, then how quick from the time you get the vaccine would it actually protect you?
You know what? Good questions. I honestly don't know. I think Dr. Redfield, when he was on the webinar, there's a task force, I think it's called BARDA, that is going to be, their job is to figure out deployment of the vaccine. So I don't know, those are great questions. I don't know the answer. I would encourage you, if you really want to track this stuff, well, the New York Times is always a good source. There's also another website called Stat News, S-T-A-T, Stat News, that is all about health and science, and they do great reporting on the coronavirus. I read them every day. And if you want to keep on top of stuff, that's probably New York Times and Stat News are great sources for immediate news on this. And also the Atlantic, you know, they're a magazine, they don't do daily news, but they have a great science writer, Ed Yong, who just writes beautifully and has done really some great stories on the coronavirus and the hunt for vaccines.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions at this stage? Mona wants to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very, very clear presentation. I want to know, when so many companies are involved in vaccine production, who is setting the standards for the efficacy of the vaccine?
So they do clinical trials. The results from the clinical trials are made public, and then the companies have to go to the FDA to get approval. So I'm assuming that the FDA is going to be the final arbiter. They're going to look at these vaccines, and they're going to be the agency that gives a thumbs up or a thumbs down on them. So that's my sense. I mean, the FDA does the same thing for, you know, all kinds of drugs and can sometimes say, well, it looks good, but you need to go back and do more testing. So I think it's going to be an issue for the FDA.
Would that mean both for the Chinese vaccine and Russian vaccine?
I think that this country is, you know, that's a good question. I honestly don't know. I would think that if the vaccine in China turns out to be positive and there is good clinical data that shows it's positive and that those results can be replicated, that that vaccine could become available as well.
I can speak from my experience I was in the medical device business, that the FDA accepts trials that are done properly outside the U.S. So if the data is something they would accept from inside the U.S. and done, they'll check the trial, but they'll accept that data. Normally, anything that passes muster in Japan or Europe will immediately be approvable in the U.S. I would think China's a new experience from when I retired 20 years ago. Okay, other questions? Come on, team, all right, Marilyn's back again.
So in that case, would we have to buy the vaccine from China, or would they share what the ingredients were so that companies here could then make it? How does that work?
Good question. I do not know. I don't know. It's a really good question.
I mean, it just seems like if they had the solution, rather than wait for getting it from there, if they would share the information, but I don't know if that's going to happen.
Yeah, I don't know either. And it was, I had, when the pandemic first began and South Korea had seemed like a really good test. I don't know why this country didn't jump on and just use their test. We had to develop our own test, which did not go well. So I honestly, I don't know the answer to the question. It's a good question.
Ann Benson.
So I really appreciated you talking about, for you, you won't feel safe until there are treatments for this kind of thing. And I'm wondering if, George, we could have one or two more of these series that talks about what's happening with treatments.
That's a good proposal. I will take that under advisement. Sue, do you have a question? Okay. Got to unmute yourself first. Then we'll go to Gabriel.
Okay. Want me to go ahead?
Unmute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
I have Sue Dibble. I have Sue Aiken first, and then Sue Dibble, and then Gabriel.
Okay. Sorry, Gabriel. My question goes back to the herd immunity. I don't fully understand that. There was just a lot of information in there, and the diagrams were helpful, but I still didn't quite understand. Maybe it's the antivirus situation. I don't know. I just don't quite understand it.
So the deal with herd immunity is that depending on the disease and how infectious it is, there's a point where if a certain percentage of the community is protected against the disease, they're not going to get COVID-19.
Okay.
So if I'm still vulnerable, but the vast majority of people in my larger community aren't going to get it, they're not going to be able to give it to me. So I'm basically, the community is overall is safe. So that's the idea. The problem comes is that when people don't take the vaccine, then there's holes in that herd, and then there can be resurgence of the disease, and that's happened with with measles. So that's the deal with herd immunity.
So everyone really needs to get it, get the vaccine in order for the herd to be sufficiently protected.
That's the best case
Perfect,
scenario.
perfect way, yeah.
Yeah, especially since you know, people have varying responses to the vaccine. I mean, some people, you know, might respond well to it. Some of us might not have that much of a response to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I can just intervene, when Avi gave us his talks, he had a diagram talking about the R factor, which is the rate of replication. And that one of the things you do as you get herd immunity is you drop down the R factor. So the problem with measles is if the R factor is 6, everyone who gets it gives it to 6 more people. You got to really get a lot of people vaccinated before you can control it. But here the R factor appears to be significantly lower.
Oh.
So that's one of the reasons they say that if they can get half the people vaccinated, it will do a great deal to keep us from picking it up.
So I just want to make a pitch. One of the webinars that I did involved Larry Brilliant, who is a world famous epidemiologist who worked with the World Health Organization and was involved in wiping out smallpox. He also was an advisor to the folks that did the movie Contagion. He's a great interview, but he talks about the R factor and just talks about how diseases spread and goes into herd immunity. He's a great guy. It was a great webinar. So if you're hanging around, you don't know what to do, check out Larry Brilliant's webinar.
Okay, Sue Dibble, then Gabriel.
A lot of science is influenced by politics. And so when you say that, you know, if China develops a wonderful vaccine and it's just marvelous and it just gets, everybody does well with it and everything, we would still probably in this country do a phase 3 randomized clinical trial on that vaccine. It really won't matter. In contrast with the European countries, which they've done, you know, they'll accept that data, but there's such a convolution of politics and science that people who have power over the scientists through money and jobs really do impact science on how it's done.
Right, that's true.
Gabriel.
So it's 4:43, so I need to pop off in a couple minutes, but I'm happy to, I wish I had more time because it'd be fun to chat, but I have another thing I have to do at 5 o'clock.
Gabriel.
Thank you for, am I still muted?
No, you're fine.
Thank you for excellent talk. And I want to follow up on the research and communication on the anti-vaxxers. I know that internationally they found that if you could get religious leaders, peer group leaders involved, for example, with polio in Pakistan and Afghanistan or Ebola, involved, that somehow can be effective to some extent. Has there been research on the demographics of who are the anti-vaxxers and what might be effective communication strategies for them? I know we have a lot in Sonoma County and Sebastopol. That was my question.
You know what, I don't, it's a good question. There's a great organization called Frameworks out of Boston. And so they look at communications, and I think they may have a project that involves public health and vaccines, and they may have some research on the best way to communicate. I don't know the answer to the question, except I can, you might want to go to Framework and check out and see what they have to say.
Okay, Kris, we're going to have one last question from Diane Nunes, and then we're off to run.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. You mentioned some webinars that are going on, one of them being Nevin's. How do we access those?
So sure, so you come to the buckinstitute.org, you come to our website.
Okay.
And at the very top of the page, there's resources for COVID-19. Click on that. you may have to, you're probably going to have to scroll down a little bit, but there are archives from all of our COVID-19 webinars on there. So, and there's also transcripts from them. So I talked to scientists. I talked to Sue Desmond-Hellman, who used to run the Gates Foundation. You know, I talked to Larry Brilliant, who's an epidemiologist. I talked to John, who takes care of older adults. So there's a lot of really great information there, and really smart people who are doing the work. So thank you for asking that question, because it gives me the chance to plug the webinars before I jump
Kris,
off.
we have to thank you very much for your
Oh, my pleasure. Everybody, stay healthy, stay safe, and come to the Buck Institute once we're once again able to open our doors to the public.
Thank you again. Okay, for everybody else, next week the topic is, we're staying on this topic. It's a chance for you to express your feelings about what you've heard, what your concerns are. I did get the message about maybe working a little bit to find a way to look at treatments, which I'll accept some help on if there are any nurses in the audience, since I know there are a few. But we can talk about maybe how to do that best. And so next week, we don't have a speaker. It's just an open session, typical Oakmont, time to express your opinions, what you're reading have said, and how you feel about the question that we raised 3 weeks ago, which is, when are we likely to be able to return to some level of normalcy here in Oakmont? So thank you all, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.